Hi there, and welcome back to another lesson with Ms. Washington. Today, we're going to be covering two very important life processes. We're going to talk about how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are intertwined and how energy is stored, released, and transferred within these two systems. All organisms in our ecosystem interact with each other to help each other survive. Today, we're going to focus on these two processes and how they're related. So first, let's ask ourselves, why do cells need to make food and break it down? Why do organisms need to make food and break it down? What's the whole point? Well, let's think about some of the life processes that we have. I like to eat. Do you like to eat? I like to sleep. I like to grow. I like to get outside, exercise, run, be active. Even plants grow and live and survive. So why do our cells need to make food and break it down? Because these processes help our organisms to live, grow, and reproduce, to carry out regular life processes. So what is photosynthesis? What is cellular respiration? Photosynthesis is the process of autotrophs, or plants, making glucose using sun or sunlight or solar energy, water, and carbon dioxide. Glucose is sugar or food for the plants. So photosynthesis is the process of plants making their own food. Cellular respiration, on the other hand, is the process of all organisms, plants and animals, making energy using glucose, breaking down that glucose to make energy, or ATP, our high energy molecule. So after plants make that sugar, they have a process to break down that sugar. Pretty cool. So how does photosynthesis work? Plants need to absorb solar energy to do photosynthesis. They need to be able to absorb sunlight in order to make their own food. The wonderful organelle called the chloroplast makes that possible. This is why plants are able to make their own food, because they have chloroplasts. As animals, unfortunately, we don't. We have to get our food source from somewhere else. But plants are able to make their own food. Chlorophyll, which is a pigment in the chloroplast, allows the plant to absorb that solar energy. It also makes the plant green. So look at these chloroplasts in these plants. They're jam-packed inside that plant cell because the plant needs to make a lot of food for itself. Let's talk about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, specifically aerobic respiration, happens in eukaryotic cells like plants and animals. Aerobic respiration is the process of breaking down glucose to make energy. So it starts in the cytoplasm. That glucose is a large molecule. So it has to get broken down into two smaller molecules called pyruvate. Whenever a molecule is broken down, it releases energy. So in this first initial process of aerobic respiration, that large glucose molecule, when it's broken down, releases 2 ATP. Now that the molecule is smaller, now that there are two smaller molecules that can be broken down further, the king mitochondria takes over and further breaks down those 2 pyruvate into smaller molecules that can be stored for energy, stored for food later. This further breaking down of these smaller molecules makes 30 more ATP, 30 plus more ATP. Because so much energy was released from the breaking down of these two molecules, the mitochondria is dubbed or called the powerhouse of the cell. Now let's look at the photosynthetic equation. Let's go back to photosynthesis. There's a special equation that plants use in order to describe their process of making food for themselves. The photosynthetic equation is made up of reactants and products. Your reactants are what your plants need, the ingredients the plants need in order to carry out the process. The products are what's made from the process. So plants need carbon dioxide or CO2 and H2O or water and sunlight or solar energy to yield, that's what that arrow means, to yield or make glucose, which is sugar, and oxygen. The molecular formula for glucose is C6H12O6. The molecular formula for oxygen is O2. So this is the photosynthetic equation. This is what plants need, or this is the process that plants go through in order to make their own food. This photosynthetic process is a process of energy storage. In this process, plants store solar energy in the form of glucose. The source of energy, the energy source of this process so where we get the energy from in this process is the sun. So our energy source for this process is the sun. It allows us to store solar energy. Well, it allows plants to store energy in the form of glucose. So again, plants need the reactants, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to yield or make the products, glucose and oxygen. Your reactants are your ingredients, what you need, and your products are what's being made. Let's look at the aerobic respiration equation. This is the process of all organisms being able to make energy, plants and animals. This process is energy release. So this process is a form of energy release. In this process, all organisms, plants and animals, use glucose and oxygen in the presence of enzymes to yield or break down that glucose and oxygen in the presence of enzymes to yield or make carbon dioxide, water, and energy or ATP, that high energy molecule. So the source of our energy for this process is actually food or glucose. So our energy source for this process, where this process gets its energy from, is from food or glucose. So plants and animals take glucose and oxygen, our ingredients, those reactants, and in the presence of enzymes, break them down to make the products, carbon dioxide, water, and energy, or ATP. So while plants can make their own food and then turn around and break it down, animals have to get our glucose from other sources, like bread and pasta and other foods. So animals do not make their own food. We have to get our glucose, our sugar from bread and pasta and other things that we eat. And in the presence of oxygen, we break it down using our enzymes to make energy, water, and carbon dioxide for ourselves. Plants are the only organism that are able to make their own food and break it down. So let's look at these two processes. Photosynthesis requires the reactants, its ingredients, it needs carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight in order to make glucose and oxygen. However, aerobic respiration needs glucose and oxygen, those reactants, to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So how are these two processes related? What do you notice about the products and the reactants? How are these two processes related in a cycle? That's right. The products of one are the reactants of the other. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of aerobic respiration. Plants make glucose and oxygen, but they also use glucose and oxygen to make energy. So they make glucose and oxygen, and then they need glucose and oxygen to make energy. Aerobic respiration makes carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is used by photosynthesis in order to start its process. So the products of one are the reactants of the other. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of aerobic respiration. The products of aerobic respiration are the reactants of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, as stated before, requires energy. It needs an energy input, whereas aerobic respiration releases energy. One last thing, there are two kinds of cellular respiration. We just talked about aerobic respiration and how we make energy using oxygen, how plants and animals make energy using oxygen. So most eukaryotes, most plants and animals use aerobic respiration in order to make energy. Some prokaryotes use aerobic respiration. This process makes 36 ATP, makes 36 units of energy. But there's another kind of cellular respiration. This process is called anaerobic respiration. It's the process of making energy without oxygen. An means no, not, or non. So anaerobic respiration is the process of making energy without oxygen. All prokaryotes use this process, and sometimes eukaryotes use this process. The process of making energy without oxygen, anaerobic respiration, only makes 2 units of ATP. Anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. So which process do you think is more efficient, which is probably better to make energy? Do you think it's aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration? Exactly. Aerobic respiration is probably a more efficient process in making energy for ourselves. There are 2 types of anaerobic respiration or fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation, which is the process of that sugar being broken down into 2 ATP and lactic acid. This lactic acid causes cramps and burning in our muscles. So if you ever catch yourself going up a couple of flights of stairs and you feel the burn in your muscles, that lactic acid is what's causing that burn. Your body is still making energy for itself, but it's just not using oxygen. It's not an efficient way. So it causes burning in your muscles. This process is used to make foods like yogurt and cheese and vegetables, pickled vegetables, sauerkraut, and sourdough bread. So common foods that we eat use this process. The other kind of fermentation is alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation is the process of yeast or bacteria breaking down glucose without the usage of oxygen into 2 ATP, carbon dioxide, and ethyl alcohol. This process is used to make foods like wine, beer, and bread. Thanks for watching, and make sure you complete your comprehension questions.